We're beginning chapter 7 of Jeremiah Burroughs' The Rare Jewel of Christian Contentment. This chapter is called The Excellence of Contentment. Having concluded our study of the lessons we are to learn, we come to the next subdivision, which is the excellence of the grace of contentment. There is a great deal of excellence in contentment. That is, as it were, another lesson for us to learn. The apostle says, "I have learned," as if he should say, "Blessed be God for this." Oh, it is a mercy of God to me that I have learned this lesson. I find so much good in this contentment that I would not for a world be without it. I have learned it, he says. Now, even the heathen philosophers had a sight of the great excellence that is in contentment. I remember reading of Antisthenes, who desired of his God, speaking after the heathenish way, nothing in this world to make his life happy but contentment. And if he might have anything that he would desire to make his life happy, he would ask them that he might have the spirit of Socrates, to be able to bear any wrong, any injuries that he ever met with, and to continue in a quiet temper of spirit whatsoever befell him. For that was the temper of Socrates. Whatever befell him, he continued the same man. Whatever cross befell him, however great, nobody could perceive any alteration of his spirit. This a heathen attained to by the strength of nature, and a common work of the Spirit. Now Antisthenes saw such an excellence in this Spirit that, as Solomon, when God said to him, "What shall I give thee?" asked of him wisdom, so he said, "If the God should put it into me to know what I have, I would desire this thing, that I might have the spirit of Socrates." He saw what a great excellence there was in this, and certainly a Christian may see an abundance of excellence in it. I shall labor to set it out to you in this chapter, that you might be in love with this grace of contentment. 1. By contentment we come to give God the worship that is due to him. It is a special part of the divine worship that we owe to God to be content in a Christian way, as he has shown to you. And I say it is a special part of the divine worship that the creature owes to the infinite Creator, that in that I tender the respect that is due from me to the Creator. The word that the Greeks have that signifies to worship is the same as to come and crouch before someone, as if a dog should come crouching to you and you be willing to lie down at your feet. So the creature, in the apprehension of its own baseness and the infinite excellence that is in God above it, when it comes to worship God, comes and crouches to this God and lies down at the feet of God. Then the creature worships God. When you see a dog come crouching to you, and by holding your hand over him you can make him lie down at your feet, then consider, thus should you do before the Lord. You should come crouching to him and lie down at his feet, even on your backs or bellies, to lie down in the dust before him, so as to be willing that he should do with you what he will. Just as sometimes you may turn a dog this way or that way, up and down with your hand, and there he lies before you according to your showing him with your hand, so when the creature shall come and lie down thus before the Lord, then a creature worships God and tenders the worship that is due to him. Now in what disposition of heart do we thus crouch to God more than when we have this state of contentment in all the conditions that God disposes us to? This is crouching to God's disposal, to be like the poor woman of Canaan, who, when Christ said it is not fit to give the children's meat to dogs, said, "The dogs have crumbs. I am a dog, I confess, but let me only have a crumb." And so, when the soul shall be in such a disposition as to lie down and say, "Lord, I am but a dog, yet let me have a crumb," then it highly honors God. It may be that some of you have not your table spread as others have, but God gives you crumbs. "Now," says the poor woman, "dogs have crumbs," and when you can find your hearts thus submitting to God, to be but as a dog, and to be contented and bless God for any crumb, I say, this is great worship of God. You worship God more by this than when you come to hear a sermon, or spend half an hour or an hour in prayer, or when you come to receive a sacrament. These are acts of God's worship, but they are only external acts of worship, to hear and pray and receive sacraments. But this is the soul's worship, to subject itself thus to God. You who will often worship God by hearing and praying and receiving sacraments, and yet afterwards will be froward and discontented, know that God does not regard such worship. He will have the soul's worship in this subjecting of the soul unto God. Note this, I beseech you. In active obedience we worship God by doing what pleases God, but by passive obedience we do as well worship God by being pleased with what God does. Now when I perform a duty, I worship God. I do what pleases God. Why should I not as well worship God when I am pleased with what God does? As it was said of Christ's obedience, Christ was active in his passive obedience and passive in his active obedience. So the saints are passive in their active obedience, and they are first passive in the reception of grace and then active. And when they come to passive obedience, they are active. Then they put forth grace in active obedience. When they perform actions to God, then the soul says, "Oh, that I could do what pleases God." When they come to suffer any cross, "Oh, that what God does might please me." I labor to do what pleases God, and I labor that what God does shall please me. Here is a Christian indeed, who shall endeavor both of these. It is but one side of a Christian to endeavor to do what pleases God. You must as well endeavor to be pleased with what God does, and so you will come to be a complete Christian when you can do both. And that is the first thing in the excellence of this grace of contentment. Number 2, in contentment there is much exercise of grace. There is much strength of grace, yea, there is much beauty of grace in contentment. There is much exercise of grace, strength of grace, and beauty of grace. I put all these together. Much exercise of grace. There is a compound of grace and contentment. There is faith, there is humility and love and patience and wisdom and hope. Almost all graces are compounded. It is an oil which has the ingredients of every kind of grace, and therefore, though you cannot see the particular grace, yet in this oil you have it all. God sees the graces of his Spirit exercised in a special manner, and this pleases God at the heart to see the graces of his Spirit exercised. In one action that you do, you may exercise one grace especially, but in contentment you exercise a great many graces at once. 2. There is a great deal of strength of grace in contentment. It argues a great deal of strength in the body for it to be able to endure hard weather and whatever comes, and yet not to be much altered by it, so it argues strength of grace to be content. You who complain of weakness of memory, of weakness of gifts, you cannot do what others do in other things. But have you this gracious heart contentment that has been explained to you? I know that you have attained to strength of grace in this, when it is as spiritual as has been shown to you in the explication of this point. If a man is distempered in his body and has many obstructions, has an ill stomach and his spleen and liver obstructed, and yet for all this his brain is not disordered, it is an argument of a great strength of brain, though many evil fumes may arise from his corrupt stomach, yet still his brain is not disordered, but he continues in the free exercise of his reason and understanding. Everyone may understand that this man has a very strong brain, so when such things do not upset him. If other people who have a weak brain do not digest but one meal's meat, the fumes that arise from their stomach disorder their brain and make them unfit for everything. Whereas these have strong heads and strong brains, though their stomachs are ill, they cannot digest meat, yet they still have the free use of their brain. This, I say, argues strength. So it is in a man's spirit. If you find many who have weak spirits, and if they have any ill fumes, if accidents befall them, you will soon find them out of temper. But there are other men who, though things fume up, still keep in a steady way, and have the use of reason and grace, and possess their souls in patience. I remember it is reported of the eagle that it is not like other fowls. When other fowls are hungry, they make a noise, but the eagle is never heard to make a noise, though it lacks food. Now it is from the magnitude of its spirit that it will not make such complaints as other fowls do when they lack food, because it is above hunger and above thirst. Similarly, it is an argument of a gracious magnitude of spirit that whatsoever befalls it, yet it is not always whining and complaining as others do, but it goes on its way in course and blesses God and keeps in a constant tenor whatever such befalls it. Things as cause others to be dejected and fretted and vexed, and take away all the comfort of their lives, make no alteration at all in the spirits of these men and women. This, I say, is a sign of a great deal of strength of grace. 3. It also is an argument of the great deal of beauty of grace. There is a saying of Seneca, a heathen, when you go out into the groves and woods and see the tallness of the trees and their shadows, it strikes an awful fear of deity in you. And when you see the vast rivers and fountains and deep waters, that strikes a kind of fear of God in you. But, he said, do you see a man who is quiet in tempests and lives happily in the midst of adversities? Why do you not worship that man? He thinks him a man worthy of such honor who will be quiet and live a happy life, though in the midst of adversities. The glory of God appears here more than in any of his works. There is no work which God has made, sun, moon, and stars, which is so full of the glory of God as a man who lives quietly in the midst of adversity. That was what convinced the king. When he saw that the 3 children could walk in the midst of the fiery furnace and not be touched, the king was mightily convinced by this, that surely their God was the great God indeed, and that they were highly beloved of their God, who could walk in the midst of the furnace and not be touched, whereas the others who came only to the mouth of the furnace were devoured. So when a Christian can walk in the midst of fiery trials without his garments being singed, and has comfort and joy in the midst of everything, like when Paul in the stocks can sing, which wrought upon the jailer, it will convince men when they see the power of grace in the midst of afflictions, when they can behave themselves in a gracious and holy manner in such afflictions that would make others roar. Oh, this is the glory of a Christian. It is what is said to be the glory of Christ. Micah 5:5. This man shall be the peace when the Assyrian shall come into our land, and he shall tread in our palaces. This man shall be the peace when the Assyrian shall come into our land. For one, to be in peace when there are no enemies is no great thing. But the text says, when the Assyrian shall come into our land, this man shall be our peace. That is, when all shall be in hubbub and uproar, yet this man shall be our peace. That is the trial of grace, when you find Jesus Christ to be peace in your hearts when the Assyrian shall come into your land. You may think you find peace in Christ when you have no outward troubles, but is Christ your peace when the Assyrian comes into the land, when the enemy comes? Suppose you should hear the enemy come marching into the city, and they had taken the works and were plundering, what would be your peace? Jesus Christ would be peace to the soul when the enemy comes into the city and into your houses. If any of you have been where the enemy has come, what has been the peace of your souls? What is said of Christ may be applied to this grace of contentment. When the Assyrian, the plunderers, the enemies, when any affliction, trouble, distress befalls a heart, this grace of contentment brings peace to the soul. It brings peace to the soul at the time when the Assyrian comes into the land. The grace of contentment is an excellent grace. There is much beauty and much strength in it. There is a great deal of worth in this grace, and therefore be in love with it. And we'll continue with chapter 7 next time. Thanks for joining us today.